The European Union has been divided over how to respond to coronavirus and the tremendous economic pressure it's creating. We've seen the EU tested by financial crises before, but could this one be different? This is Roundtable. Hello, I'm Robin Dwyer. One of the founding fathers of the modern European Union has said that coronavirus is a threat to the bloc's future. Jacques Delors has described the outbreak as a mortal danger to the EU.
We've seen Eurozone bailouts, a refugee crisis, and Brexit. But now the European Union has to deal with an even more challenging problem: the coronavirus outbreak. Some member states have been affected by the virus more than others. Italy has recorded more deaths than any other country in the world, with more than 16,000. Spain has seen more than 13,000. The EU has faced criticism, accused of failing to help Italy in the early phase of the crisis, while Russia and China sent medical supplies. The former European Commission President Jacques Delors has warned that a lack of solidarity poses a mortal danger to the European Union. Member nations have been divided over how to respond to the financial crisis created by COVID-19. 9 of them, including Italy and Spain, proposed a system of so-called corona bonds. This would mean a country could borrow money but get backing from the entire Eurozone, so it would be seen as less risky and borrowing costs would be kept down. Other nations have resisted, although European Council President Charles Michel said EU states stand ready to make use of all instruments that are necessary. So will the response to coronavirus bind the EU together or leave it weaker and more divided?
Joining us on the roundtable today, we have Fabio Massimo Parenti, who is in Rome in Italy. He's an associate professor in international political economy at China Foreign Affairs University. We also have Waltraud Schelkler, who is a professor in political economy at the European Institute at the London School of Economics. And Peter Klepper is a policy analyst, Property Rights Alliance. He is joining us from Brussels. Thank you very much all for being on the programme. So let me ask you, first of all, what is your assessment of how the European Union is managing this coronavirus crisis? Let me start with you, Fabio.
Okay, I think it is quite clear under the light of the international public opinion that Europe and also the entire Western world is acting slowly in an uncoordinated way and in certain cases in a very chaotic way, because there are 3 main steps that we can identify in this story of the last 3 months. First of all, critics towards Chinese government after the first drastic draconian measures. Secondly, underestimations. And thirdly, very slow answer and reaction to a lesson and a problem that already have been experienced by other countries in the Far East. So this is my general, how can I say, description of the general trends in these last months.
And how about you, Waltraud? What's your assessment?
I do understand that it looks from Italy as a very uncoordinated, ungenerous first response, and it was. But after the first misstep, not responding to Italy's urgent call to get help, and it was excruciating to watch that then China responded first. The EU did coordinate. It did coordinate its fiscal response, that is a response, the aggregate, the sum of all the national responses, faster than the United States. The ECB, again, after first misstep by Christine Lagarde, having a speech that was too clever by half, correcting herself and coming out with actually a really good program that is targeted long-term lending that is based on the banks must lend to business. That was a good program, but it was lost in translation and in that other misstep. So the EU has not given a good picture, but actually the practice is better than you would think. And so I'm not quite as pessimistic, but I do understand that when you are in that dire situation, as our Italian friends and colleagues are, the disappointment is understandable.
And how about you, Peter? How do you think the EU has been dealing with this so far?
Well, of course, health policy is not a competence of the European Union. And I think actually that's a good thing. You know, the kind of measures that have been taken are incredibly intrusive. So I don't think the EU has the democratic legitimacy to take those measures. So it's not fair to criticize the EU on that basis. Now, if you look at solidarity provided by other European countries, I think the criticism is fair. That it was rather late, but ultimately there has been some support given. Germany has taken over patients from Italy, for example. Now the big question is now what do we do now? I think most people agree that some emergency support, also financial, is acceptable if it is indeed emergency support. The proposals coming from the governments of Spain and Italy are not really emergency related. They want joint borrowing schemes, despite the fact that these governments do not exactly have a great track record when it comes to financial management. So what government would jointly issue debt with governments that have a very bad track record financially? I don't think this is very responsible. It's also not very democratic. You cannot ask voters in Germany or the Netherlands to basically commit financially together with governments that they cannot democratically control. Very important is indeed the measures announced by the European Central Bank, but I don't think that these are good measures. I mean, these will, of course, be financed by increasing the money supply even more. And of course, at some point, this will bring about the danger of inflation. So far, we haven't seen inflation because the velocity of money has been rather low. But I think it testifies of a complete lack of economic history to ignore these dangers, and I think it's incredibly dangerous. If emergency support is given, we can agree or disagree on that. But I think it has to be financed through taxes and not through the printing press, because if we really want to destabilize society, we have to create a lot of money. So I think what Christine Lagarde and the ECB have done is incredibly, incredibly dangerous.
Look, can I say one thing about this point? It's a legitimate position. Our analyst friend from Brussels, if I remember well, but I think it's completely a wrong position. It's the second step in which this is an official position in which European Union keep lacking solidarity. If we want to be a community, we need to start rethinking the basic value. The European dream that was written at the beginning by many socialist and communist members from Italy, and not only, was a dream of building a society at macro-regional level. If we still attach to financial discipline, to monetaristic neoliberal approach, European Union, like Vucic said, is already dead, is finished. There is no space to really think about the continuation of European Union has this experience. We have to share debt, we have to share destiny, and for this reason, the wisest position and narrative that we have nowadays comes from China, a community with a shared destiny. If we want to prevail peace and solidarity over hyper-competition and egoism and selfish approach, we need to rethink the basic cultural points of European Union. It's unacceptable that nowadays an emergency crisis should be managed all together, sharing risks, because the macroeconomic figures about the financial status of our countries are not always correct. For example, in terms of asset debt at family level, Italy is consistently in a better position than Germany or other countries, or also Netherlands. And in terms of primary budget surplus, Italy is doing a great job during the last 15 years, and we go in deficit only because the interest rates on our debt. So we cannot be attached to financial figures, avoiding to manage and to rethink our way to stay together. We have cultural differences, but we have to find a common track. Otherwise, we are already finished, because we already have 3 Europes: Visegrad, European Mediterranean countries, and Germany, Austria, and Netherlands axe.
Can I also say, Peter Klepper, I mean, you're defending a position and a policy that no nation state would do at the moment to finance all these emergency measures via taxes, would worsen the crisis, because you could only take it from those who are still in safe employment, and that's only about 80 to 70% of the previous workforce, because the others are on furlough or unemployed, and the numbers are rising. So you would tax the smaller half. I think in the long run, it has to be that those with safe jobs and good salaries have to be taxed higher, but you would wait until the worst of a crisis is over. That is potentially a very serious crisis. Solidarity that my Italian colleague here asks for is also not the opposite of rationality and of good economic sense. You do not want these countries that have been now hard hit by a shock that is nobody's fault, that is just a virus that has turned into a pandemic. The only ones you could perhaps criticize is that the Chinese authorities suppressed the news that they had, it said, since November or even December, but certainly not the Italian or the Spanish authorities. So at that point, there is an enlightened self-interest in that we in Europe help each other. We are also a relatively rich continent. We can help each other, and that so that they can keep the lockdown that protects everybody in an open community, keep that lockdown and doesn't force people to go out to work officially or unofficially. You need to give the authorities in countries that are harder hit than everybody else the ability to fight this pandemic in their own country, and that is a collective interest. And yes, there's also a bit of empathy that any human being would have in a situation like this.
Oh, but one point. First of all, you can trust me, or better, I'm sure that you don't have surely any proof, any possibility to provide evidence that China cover up the situation at the beginning, because everything has been shared since the end of December with the organization of World Health Organization. This is the first point. So nobody has evidence of hiding information, but the opposite, sharing information. In fact,
okay, we are not discussing now whether China has hidden something or not. There was a doctor that died and had warned earlier.
We can conclude this. I don't care as well, but this is a point that I was making at the beginning. We wasted time to criticize China without having a direct and good information sometimes, just politically.
Both can be true at the same time.
Yes, but moving to the Western experience, after 2 months of data, of information, of the only way to react, we just waited. we just did in Italy, but also in Spain, but also in other countries with different efficient measures. I'm not here to give a grade to anyone, but we did a bad work step by step, also in UK, saying one day this is not a problem, then the other day maybe we have to lock down and close the movement of people, and then United States the same thing. So who hide data? I'm not sure about our performance because a lot of confusion at the beginning. But anyway, we have to remind, as economists also, I'm international relations professors with economic skills as well, that the economy is a human being creation, and so that rationality applied according to monetaristic principle, it is not an absolute truth. Historically, debt can be used to support people in crisis, can be used for infinite length of time, just to support well-being. So we have to, as we are doing as a European Union, to suspend the Maastricht regulation that were acceptable at the beginning of the process, and step by step they have become crazy numbers and crazy constraints. Nowadays we have to change our economic and political paradigm in order to consider that we can print money, okay, delete debt at the end of the process, and supporting each other in strengthening our future for longer time with long vision about our integration policy project.
Apologies, let me just jump in here, because one of the proposed options are the so-called corona bonds, which are under discussion. Again, a divisive idea. What's the likelihood that this would be a good outcome for the EU? And what's also the likelihood that it will be agreed that this is the way forward?
Well, can I jump in here?
Yes, Peter.
That's okay. So, I mean, since 2010, we already have transfers within the Eurozone, and there is a central institution, it's called the European Stability Mechanism, which has been basically effectively jointly borrowing on the market in order to raise money to then hand out to countries in trouble with conditions attached. So has this policy stabilized the Eurozone? I don't think so, to be honest. Has it incentivized reforms in countries that needed to be reformed? Only to a degree. Some reforms have been taken. Has this policy that was perhaps well-intended, these transfers, has this brought people in the Eurozone closer together, or has it created strife? I think it's fair to say that these transfers have created discord, have created strife. Of course, the people that were supposed to pay for it were not happy, and the people that were supposed to accept the conditions linked to the payments were not happy either. So, of course, what they want to do now is to repeat this. At the moment, there is a meeting of Eurozone finance ministers going on, the Euro group. It's likely that some compromise will come out of that, perhaps not today, but at some point. I don't think it will be Euro bonds or Corona bonds. I think it will be ESM loans, but with only very light conditions attached. So the Italian government can more easily defend this at home. Will this stabilize the monetary union? Of course not, because we have very underlying conditions to this monetary union that are problematic. At the end of the day, if monetary unions are in trouble, then the escape is always allow the central bank to print money. As I said, I think this is very dangerous, very irresponsible. We have seen many examples in history where this went wrong and especially hurt the weakest, because the poorer you are, the less able you are to defend yourself against this money printing. But nevertheless, because it's indeed, as the colleague in London has pointed out, because it's so hard to justify higher taxes to spend, central banks are the last resort. So then basically people pay just as they would pay through taxes, but through the back door. However, the difference is that the cost to society is much higher, because you not only have the cost of the inflation tax, but also the fact that money becomes unreliable. And this is not just a North versus South thing. In Italy, there are many savers, many people that will be hit, have already been hit by these irresponsible monetary policies. What needs to happen? Well, I guess we all have to sit together. If it's true that Italy's debt is too high and will never be repaid, well, then there has to be a debt restructuring. I mean, to increase the debt burden when you know that this debt will not be repaid is basically sending the bill to our grandchildren, and I don't think that is very responsible. However, so far in the Eurozone, debt restructuring has been avoided like the plague. Only Greece have benefited from a degree of debt restructuring, but I think it's written in the stars that at some point we'll have to sit together. And if it is indeed true what the Italian professor said, that Italy has a primary surplus, but still it cannot generate growth, then of course the answer is obvious. It's not that Italy is a bad country or something, or has no capacity. It is that the debt is simply too high to ever be repaid. So it's better to be honest about that, and then to in an orderly way organize a debt restructuring instead of
my young
grandchildren.
analyst. Your point. Unfortunately, I understand, because this is a mantra that we heard during the last 15, 20 years. It's an old argument. It's a groundless old argument, not because I have to defend the Italian position. That is not the point at all. Okay, the point is that we could save Greece with a minimum efforts, whilst we destroyed Greece poor and weak economy. And now we are going to do the same mistake. Why? Look at Japan, okay? 230% of GDP. No country in economic history repay its debt. It's a long-term process. How much you are reliable to repay your debt in an endless way, okay? Because debt is a structural fact in each country with lower or higher debt ratio with GDP. So French has 100% of debt. In Germany, if we account that part of public debt of local lender administration and state-controlled firms and banks, the debt is much higher than 60%. Is not an issue of debt, an issue that we have. If we have a single monetary policies in Europe, we have to integrate fiscally and politically. We cannot use only the monetary policy without an equal European fiscal policies and then imposing what countries have to do according just to monetary principles. It is completely old argument, out of history. Now we are going out of Europe if this paradigm will not be changed. Not because I'm saying this. It's a process that is already ongoing.
Well, let me bring in Waltraud here, because the Spanish Prime Minister said that the survival of the EU is at stake over its response to the coronavirus. Do you think the EU can withstand this? Will it survive?
It can, of course it can, but it can also lose all support. It is a dangerous crisis for the EU, and if it doesn't quickly show that it can handle this next unexpected, unprecedented crisis, one has to admit that much. You know, it's fine for us to sit here and pronounce what the government should do. I mean, it is not an easy thing to underwrite half of your economy, half of your employment. So that much has to be said also in favor of governments that are united in a European Union, which is a historically singular, close cooperation between governments, a voluntary cooperation between governments. And the Spanish Prime Minister is right. A Corona bond would be a good start, to get back to your earlier question. because it shows, and is the difference between these guaranteed issues of the European Stability Mechanism, about which the Belgian colleague has talked, namely that you have a joint liability and not each one for its share in this bond issue. So that it cannot happen that Spain, which was a fiscally completely responsible country, and Italy, that since years has struggled to get its debt down, but it kept it kind of stable, at least, that they are now picked up because they have to raise their debt. At the moment, there is nobody else in the balance sheet of governments that can keep whole countries from going into a downward spiral that we have not seen before.
Clearly a lot of strong views on this subject. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. Fabio Massimo Parenti, Walter Schelkler and Peter Kleber. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for TRT World Roundtable. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.